good, at least I got another crafts person here.
They were teasing me about coming to learn about how to do sermon.
No,
Oh,
I'll go ahead and get started. Nobody preaches the same way, you know. We all go, most of us go to school and we have a class or something on preaching somewhere along the line. Most of the time it's going to be required. You know, I actually started preaching before I had the class, way back, long time ago. So when I finally had a class on it in seminary, but I don't know if we were required to take just one or more. And I went across the street from the Episcopal Seminary and took it from the guy who was UCC, United Church of Christ. And the class was called Preaching on Controversial Issues. That's juicy. And he said, so what do you think preaching on controversial issues is all about? And I go, you know, capital punishment or, you know, gun control or whatever. He said, yeah, those could be controversial. And he said, if there's one person in your congregation who will disagree with you, that's a controversial issue. So his point, even though he called it controversial issues, and most of the time when we were preaching on sort of big issues. It was his thing was that you're hardly never going to be in a room where everybody is exactly the same way. So what are you going to do? How are you going to deal with it? So that's what we did. So this is my approach, and I've developed this over a long period of time, like I know the same probably as in the dean. You know, anybody who's been doing this develops an approach. And I don't even remember what he taught us what Doug Adams taught us in preaching on controversial issues. So that was long, 40 many years ago. So, but I want to start just by asking, what's a sermon? So, you know, and I want you to answer this question when you look in the bulletin and you see down there, somewhere along the line, something that says sermon or homily. What do you expect? Well, what do you want to hear? What do you come to church wanting to hear? Now, maybe that you come to church for communion or you come for the music or something like that, and that the sermon is a big deal, which is fine. But if you're going to sit there and wait through, you know, so you want to sing the hymn that's after the sermon, you got to wait. You know, what do you want to hear? So tell me.
I'm going to challenge that workout.
Challenges of things to work on. So that, okay.
I am most interested in getting insight or having you unpack what is usually the gospel. I personally am much more interested in the New Testament than I am the Old Testament.
I look forward to your historical. I enjoy your historical part of, you know, what the sermon's about, because I'm a history buff. But I always enjoy that, you know, what kind of liturgy, you know, we're looking at that week.
Okay? So I'm hearing personal application, I'm hearing exposition of the New Testament, I'm hearing about historical background. What else?
It's interesting because the next two meetings for the men's group, we're going to do the scriptures and try to, you know, we'll have a leader and unpack them. And then we're going to see how that compares to what the records.
Oh, so you're going to spend all summer working up all these really great things. And then when I come back and load it for bed.
I know.
Anything else?
I'm sometimes looking to hear explanation of some of the scriptures which are sometimes overlooked, to say the least, or to hear something sort of maybe change my point of view or maybe challenge my point of view in some way about the subject. Challenge is what I guess the challenge. But something to work on during the week, kind of mull over and ponder.
I see Whit has joined us. Whit, if you want to say something, wave your hand, because I didn't bring in the other the other speaker, I forgot to do that, so I'm gonna have to run over and make sure that the other speakers are turned up loud. So if you have a question. All right, so all of those, are really good, really helpful things that I've heard. And, you know, so that's, knowing how to manage expectations is one of the things that public speakers have to do, right? And that's kind of what this is. So, I thought, well, let's figure out what a sermon is. So I went to everybody's favorite source, Wikipedia. So Wikipedia says a sermon is a religious discourse or oration, I like that, by a preacher, usually a member of clergy, but it doesn't have to be. Sermons address a scriptural, theological, or moral topic, usually expounding on a type of belief, law, or behavior within both past and present contexts. Elements of the sermon often include exposition, exhortation, and practical application. So, exposition, talking about unpacking the New Testament. Practical application, that's what you were talking about. Part of the history is exposition. So we've got, you know, so that's basically what's there. But then there's this other definition. In secular usage, the word sermon may refer, often disparagingly, to a lecture on morals. You know, that's the way kids think about it a lot. Well, the prayer book doesn't define a sermon. Okay? But it tells preachers what we're supposed to do. So in the ordination for a priest, the bishop tells us it will be your task to proclaim by word the gospel of Jesus Christ. You're to preach, and then declare forgiveness, pronounce blessing, share in administration of baptism, celebration. You know. But proclaim by word and indeed the gospel of Jesus Christ. That's pretty broad. Pretty broad. In the Catechism, the ministry of a priest is to represent Christ in his church, particularly as pastor to the people, to share with the bishop and overseeing of the church, to proclaim the gospel. Okay, again, that's the proclamation thing that we're supposed to be doing, proclaiming the gospel. Then, for a deacon, it's slightly different. As a deacon in the church, you're to study Holy Scriptures. Priests aren't supposed to do that anymore, I guess. Because it's not in there. You're to make Christ and his redemptive love known by your word and example, and you are to interpret to the church the needs, concerns, and hopes of the world. Nadine referred to that last week. She didn't explicitly say it, but she claimed her orders as a deacon to say, this is how I'm going to be talking about the lessons as I see them. So that's the only direction that the prayer book gives us. I think that they're going to assume that we learned the craft of preaching in seminary or someplace else. Then there are some other thoughts, and these are, I think, pretty significant. Karl Barth, famous 20th century, early 20th century theologian, said, take your Bible and take your newspaper and read both, but interpret newspapers from your Bible. So he was characterized as that, saying, hold the Bible in one hand, newspaper in the other. That's how you preach. But interpret the news through the lens of the Bible. So you can't just do one, okay? Then another one that lots of clergy have heard many times, and I was looking it up to find out what the roots of it were, and it's this guy named Finley Peter Dunn was writing about newspapers. He said newspapers are supposed to comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. And preachers took that really quickly. Clergy took that really quickly. There's another standard cliche about clergy that we're supposed to be the unanxious presence in an anxious situation. Okay? So, this comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. In other words, if you're really comfortable, you can't take that for granted. But if you're suffering, you need comfort. Well, that raises the questions then down at the bottom of the page. Who's the audience? Who's in the room? And so when I'm standing there, or anybody is standing there in the pulpit, especially if they're familiar with the congregation, And they know who's sitting in that seat over there, who always sits in that seat over there, and who's sitting in that seat over there, and who's sitting way back in the back. And this person over here just had a death in the family, and this person over here just had a birth in the family, this person over here just lost a job, and this person over here just graduated from college. Who's in the room? Are you going to afflict the comfortable? Are you going to comfort the afflicted? Are you going to do expository preaching? Are you going to be a historian? These are some of the challenges that we address when we come into this. Now, let me just say, I'm not saying all of this to say this is how hard it is to be a preacher. It's just all of these are things that sort of come into play. And one week I may want to afflict the comfortable, and the other week I may want to do the next thing, comfort the afflicted. When I was in Berkeley, as the campus minister at UC Berkeley, and many of you have heard about that before, we'll hear about it again in the next service. I would travel from church to church, the 5 churches in Berkeley that supported the campus ministry. And I would preach in all of these churches. They had very, very different characters. And I knew which were the ones that really wanted to be comforted, and I knew the ones that really needed to be afflicted. So it was, at least I could do that when I was walking into all of these different churches. I was there for 11 years. This was after about the first 4 I got to know the characters of the congregations. When I would go into, as a guest preacher, and you, I'm sure, have this, you go into a guest preacher and you don't really know, you're kind of right down the middle, mostly on the comfort the afflicted side, because you don't have any credence to afflict the comfortable. So, and there are all of these old things that preachers would be taught. 3 points. You give an introduction, and then you make your 3 points. It's a 3-point sermon, and then you give your conclusion. And that's your sermon. It's kind of like the standard old writing instructions, right? 3 paragraphs. Oh, that's the same thing, 3-point sermon. And then another one was tell them what you're going to tell them, and then tell them what you told them. So these are all these little bits and pieces of advice that come out for preachers. Well, so now you're going to get how I do it, and how I do this. That was my desk on Monday morning, okay? I start work generally on Mondays, start my work on preaching. And there is my computer, and I'll get to that in a minute, a blank piece of 8.5, or 8 by 10, kind of like 8 by 10, blank piece of paper, and a number 2 Ticonderoga pencil with a single-use sharpener. I've done that for years. It just is part of the rhythm. You get into rhythm. So this is what's on, and I don't expect you to be able to read any of this. That's not why it's there, but it's to show you. So I have this wonderful Bible study program, and I can set up there in the upper left-hand corner, it says Easter 5B, even if you can't read that. And then across, you see the next set of tabs, one for each of the lessons up there. And then below that are the texts. And on the far left is going to be the original language. And the next one is King James. And the next one is the New Revised Standard. And the next one is the Message. And then the bottom one is the Common English Bible, which is what we use here. So I have all of those available. So if I have a question about a word and I want to see how somebody else translated it, it's just right there. And I don't always go to the Greek. It used to be that I would translate the Greek each time, but I started doing that like 30 years ago, and I've already done it. So I don't need to go and translate it again. So I have that up there. And what do I do? I thought, I'm not going to do this, it'll take too long. I'd rather have a conversation. What I thought about was having y'all read the 3 lessons, not the psalm, but the 3 lessons for today. So you would basically start where I started, reading these things or hearing these things, sort of. But I'm going to, unless you want to go through that exercise. Anybody want to? I don't see any hands. Okay. And then I was going to say at the end of this, what did you hear? Or what did you read when you were going through these lessons? Because this is where, at least where I start, and I imagine, Sandy, is where you start, is you read the lessons and then, what strikes you, right? Well, I've developed over the course of many years, and I've done this for a long time, a very, it's expanded over the years, but a lot of this is very similar. So I start out with my white piece of paper, and I put down the lessons, that's on the left. So the first 4 lessons, the collect of the day, the newspaper, what's going on, current events, what's going on in my life, and then what else is going on in the calendar? Is it Memorial Day? Something going on at Good Shepherd. And I read through all of the lessons, and over there on the bottom right-hand corner, that says, although I'm sure you can read it, right? Any questions, ideas, theology, or themes. Are there things that I'm seeing after I read 2 of them? Is there a theme? Or is there something that could be a theological question that would arise? The incarnation, let's say. So there's a question that might arise, something that just shows up in the text as I'm reading it. So that's what it looks like after I've done that. Okay? So I do that, and then the next, usually, sometimes I try and do more than one thing on one day. I originally set these aside so I could do something every day. Then I start with another set of questions. And these actually came out of some work on theological reflection, EFM in particular. So I go back to the texts and I ask up there, is there an image? Particular image, it could be a riot, that's an image. Is there an object that shows up? The cross. Okay. Is there a gesture, somebody bowed down? There's a position, the position of the author may be persecuted. Okay? So I go through each of the texts and I answer those questions. Then in the middle of the page, I ask, well, is there a word from God in the text? And sometimes it's very explicit. Go, sell all you have and give the money to the poor. That's a word from God. Next, and so that's called, what in theological language, that's called revelation. Is there revelation in the text? The next piece is theology, it's about God. So what does the text say about God? It may be God is merciful, quick to forgive. Okay. I don't know. And then the last one is to God. Is the text a prayer? Is there something in the text that's a prayer? Can I go through and answer that for all of those texts? And then the last little bit down there is I asked what was the original significance of the text. So sometimes it's real clear that whoever is writing was writing to a particular context and had something very specific to say about, Moses comes down the mountain and finds a golden calf. Moses is addressing a particular context about a golden calf, and then has that been encountered or superseded? It may be that we were going to go back and rebuild Jerusalem. Well, at this point, there's no Jerusalem, right? Sometime later there was no Jerusalem, or whatever. So are there current implications? And sometimes those spin across. And then the bottom thing there says heart of the matter. If I'm looking through all of this, am I discerning what the heart of all of these texts have to say? And when I get done with that, that's what it looks like. And if you'll see over on the left-hand side of the right-hand sheet, you'll see arrows. Little arrows, you see those? Those are the places where I was particularly caught by what I read. So, and that'll come back, we'll come back to that in a minute. Then I go back and I ask another set of questions. So I'm asking a lot of questions in the text. So up at the top there, it is what is the main question that the text addresses? So, for example, in the lesson that we heard or will hear from Acts, Philip goes and converts an Ethiopian eunuch. The question that's asked is, can anybody but Jews be saved? That's an underlying question, right, that the text is addressing. So I go through and I look at those. Sometimes they're telling a story, and the story that they're relating is, this is when it was so cool. So what's the best of the past? Sometimes there's really good news. You know, God sent his only son. That's good news. That's constant. And then is the text asking something of me or of us? You know, is there a prompting? Then I get to this one down, the second one up from the bottom, context. Is there a particular context? Like they're in Babylon, and they're trying to figure out what it's all about to be, the Jews are in Babylon, trying to figure out what it's all about to be in exile. Or they're in Jerusalem, and the Jerusalem church is trying to figure out, hey, we've all been Jews, now what are we going to do with these Gentiles? There's a context. What's the context? What's the geography? Is there anything interesting in the geography? And then who's the audience? Who is this directed at? Now, I added this one as a question to me because sometimes in the Gospels, Jesus will be talking to the crowds, and sometimes he'll be talking to his followers, his disciples. Are the requirements the same for those who are his closest followers as to those who just come up and want a free meal? So who's the audience to which, I'm curious about that. And so, okay, well, I've got this on my cool little Bible study program. I can call up a map. So, the angel from the Lord spoke to Philip, at noon, take the road that leads from Jerusalem to Gaza. Well, Jerusalem's there right smack dab in the center, although you can't read it. And these are the main Roman roads at that time. So you have to figure out what road did he take, because it says this is a desert road. So it must be the one that was going down the center? I don't know, and then had to cut across to Gaza? I don't know. But then, they have this conversation, and then all of a sudden, the Spirit took Philip away. Philip found himself in Azotus, and you see it sort of in red, up almost on the coast, above Ashdod. I was just kind of curious as to when the Spirit took him to Azotus, how far was that? If the Spirit took him, I don't know what kind of euphemism that is, but how far did he have to go? So I was just curious. And then he preached all the way up to Caesarea, which is up the top. That's quite a bit. So I'm curious about geography, and that showed up in the sermon this morning, and you'll hear it if you haven't already, when I said that the eunuch was on his way from Jerusalem to Gaza. How far is that? Well, it is not the distance of Denver to Colorado Springs. So to give you some context. So I do that. And then the last one on that other sheet is I look at this little book here by a disciple of Christ, pastor called Love Notes from God. And she doesn't comment on every, but she'll pull out a passage and then she'll say, here's God talking to you on the context of this passage. I mean, sometimes those are really kind of cool. But the other thing is when I'm doing my normal daily prayers, I make comments on the lessons as I'm reading. And I record those. That's what's down here on the bottom of this thing. So this lesson was the Acts lesson for this morning. And over the course of years, those are comments that I made, reflections that I made on that Acts passage. So I'm going back and looking about how I thought about this passage for the last 4 or 5 years. Sometimes it relates to the church, sometimes it relates to me, sometimes it relates to my family, but they're just other ways of sort of shedding light on the text. Any questions on any of that? Nobody else does it this way.
I'm more interested because you do very visual things with, and I'm wondering how you get all that to apart. How do you let me find a eunuch and chariot.
Okay, hold on. Yeah.
But because you did your dissertation on eunuchs, did that drive you towards that scripture?
Yes and no. Because I know what Nadine preached on last week, and I have an idea what Bishop Epting's going to preach on next Sunday, when they were going to focus more on John, I think. And so, I went back to the eunuch stuff partly because it was, my dissertation had nothing to do with Philip, all right? It had to do with eunuchs. And this passage was a small chunk in there. But it's fun. It's a fun story, you know, and it just kind of goes in a lot of different directions. So that's what it looks like once I go through all of those questions and answers. And again, you see arrows over there on the right, on the left-hand side of the right. Okay. Then I start the serious work of doing scholarly research. All of the rest of this is my asking questions, is what I am bringing to the text. Even the book from Sandra Jha isn't scholarly research, it's more of a devotional kind of thing. It was 365 days of devotions, right? So now I'm getting heavy into the scholarly stuff. And so this page here is called Lectionary Greek. It's done by a Lutheran. And he goes through mostly the New Testament stuff. Every so often he'll jump into the Old Testament and do Hebrew. And I like looking at this because it often generates more questions and is kind of elucidation. And I'm taking notes. I'm not going to show you all my notes after this because it's just more pieces of paper with pencil on, right? With arrows. And then so that's Lutheran. Then I look, there's in the magazine, the Episcopal Church magazine called The Living Church, there's a section at the back called Sunday's Readings. And it's basically 4 paragraphs on something from the readings of any particular Sunday. And so they're usually put out about a month in advance, and the next one come out. You can also find them online. And I like reading them. I don't often use anything that I found in there. A lot of what I find is that they're quoting big chunks of text and then a 1-sentence comment on the big chunk of text. And so there's a lot of black on a white page, but there's not a lot of meat in the black. Sometimes they'll ask a question and it will spark something. Then I go to this page, the Adventurous Lectionary, and this guy is a United Church of Christ pastor, very progressive. So I got a Lutheran, pretty conservative Lutheran, the Episcopal Church, and then this progressive congregational pastor. And I read all of these. The congregationalist usually doesn't go up until like 3 days before the Sunday. And so he's often right on current events. He's commenting on current events. The Episcopal Church one is more general, and then the Lutheran is all about the text. So, but they're all bringing different perspectives to all of this. And then in the magazine, long-time mainline Christian publication called The Christian Century, there's another section that's called Sunday's Coming. This one comes in email as well. And so I look at all of these. Again, they're just things to spur questions, to give me insights, and all of that. Then I get the hard copy stuff. So I sit down and I go through all of the lessons in the Interpreter's Bible Commentary. I will usually get one of the best commentaries that I can find on the Gospels and do a heavy deep dive into the Gospel. If it's appropriate, if there's, for example, if there's a woman that's mentioned in one of the lessons, I'll go to the Women's Bible Commentary because that, again, brings a different lens onto the story. What's being told about the woman, what's not being told about the women, how are they being treated, how are they not being treated, just fascinating to know. I've often referred to this book in the middle by Plaut on the Torah. He's a Reformed Jew, so his commentary on Matthew, or on Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, all of that, from a very Jewish perspective, it's really good stuff, raises questions based on the fine points of Hebrew that I would never get. And again, so I use that sometimes. If it's Isaiah or Ezekiel or something like this, I'll look at Abraham Joshua Heschel, famous Jewish scholar. So I'll be reading a Jewish scholar on the prophets. And occasionally I'll need something else. I want to know more about Philip. So those of you who heard the sermon this morning or will hear, I'll talk about Philip and where he did and all these kinds of things. It's faster for me to go to a Bible dictionary and look up Philip and get the data really quickly. If I want to deep dive into a particular word in Greek, there are lexicons. And sometimes I just want a quick note about something, and I'll go to a study Bible. So some of these I don't look at every time, but they're available at my desk. And so I can pull them out and just take a quick look at them to sort of get some. So at the end of all of this, I go back to all of those pages and all of the arrows. And I rewrite down all of the things that I had written down before that I had said, pay attention to this. Okay? So that's where all of those arrows came up. What happened with all those arrows, all of those texts, all of those different readings, all of the commentaries. And I sit down and I look at them and I wonder, what's the theme that seems to arise out of here this time in this context? So I'm just gonna give an example. If I'm looking at this set of lessons before Stewardship Sunday, I might pick a different set of things that I put arrows by than if it was before Pentecost or something like that. So there's context to it, at least the way that I do this. Knowing that Good Shepherd has its character, I would say things preached differently here than I would at the cathedral, just because the context, expectations are different. So I sit down with that, and then that's what I pray for. And because this is what this is where every preacher is going to come up differently. Even if you have all of the same sets of notes, the miracle that happens in your head and your heart is different than mine, or Chris's, or Mary's, or Cal's. That's where we bring ourselves into it. And there's no way of all I have to say is that the miracle occurs on Thursday. I sleep better before Sunday. If it occurs on Friday, that's marginally okay. There have been weeks where the miracle didn't occur until Saturday afternoon. So
It's a miracle sometimes not happen.
pardon?
It's a miracle sometimes not get there before Sunday.
Well, you can tell me. So then what happens is that we get a text, right? So this is, what you would see if you were to go pick up one off of it. That's theoretically the text. All right,
Do you do the text as soon as the miracle occurs?
the miracle generates the text. And so that was what happened, all right, until March 20th, 2019. Okay? And then we went into this thing. And I recognized after a while that looking at a little box that says the homily and an even tinier box of the preacher, it's not going to hold anybody's attention. And it's a lost opportunity. That's what I saw it as a teacher, which is what I fundamentally think. That was a lost opportunity. And so if people are staring at a screen, why don't I use it? It might just be to show how far it is from Jerusalem to Gaza. And you've got a context there. But as somebody who worked on college campuses and was so accustomed to going to presentations and PowerPoint presentations or watching TED Talks and seeing all that, I think I can go further with that. And so I started thinking about, well, how else can I do this? And I thought, well, let's see, where am I going to find these pictures? So there's this page, there's this thing that you can go to that's called Google Images, images.google.com. And there's this wonderful search bar. And so that is where I got those pictures. It's the Ethiopian unicorn, right? And it gives me thousands. And of course, I probably only ever look at 200. A lot of times they begin to repeat because they'll just show up from another source. And so I go through, and what happens is I'll go through and be reading the text, and then I'll look for an image. And it all depends on what you're searching for, right? Now, Ethiopian eunuch, that's going to give you a few things, right? If it's Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch, then Philip will show up in there, might show up in the other one, if I want Philip. Baptism, Ethiopian eunuch, that narrows it down. So then it's this, it's the art of search terms. And that can give me what I want. Is there another way that I can put it that's going to generate the kind of image that I want? And sometimes an image will show up and say, that says it better than what I had in the text. And now I'm going to alter the text because I really like that image and it says it better. So they've come into conversation with one another. And I start generating the text with the image. And the other thing that I like, and if you saw the sermon this morning, you see it any time, I probably showed 7 different images of the Ethiopian eunuch. I think I only repeated one once. There were some that were clearly from European painters, some that were from maybe like Ethiopian artists, to get all of these different perspectives on this so that we don't think that there's only one way to depict this event or anything else. And I try and find something that might make somebody smile and shake them back up and make them awake again, or things like that. Or perhaps to drive home a point in a way that I can't verbally, but that the picture will cause somebody to think something that I don't feel like I can say in what the same thing.
So when you're back in, I call them bullets, you got arrows.
Yeah.
You got, okay, kind of your talking points or
Yeah.
things real impactful. You start to think about, I need a picture for that, or do you write the whole thing up and then look for the picture and then you?
Sometimes, some things are really, really visual, so I don't have to think about that. Other times I'll think, oh, that would be a good place to come in. And so it works both ways. But Ethiopian eunuch is pretty visual. Now, it would be hard to preach on the Gospel of John, the thing from today, with a lot of pictures. God is love, love is God. How many times are we going to show the same slide that says God is love? So that's why sometimes some of these things are easier to illustrate because they lend themselves to that. And neither one of the Johns, whether it's 1 John or the Gospel of John, today lend themselves to that in quite the same way. But this is very visual. And especially when you're talking about different.
Is that why you didn't preach on John? You preached on Acts instead?
I didn't think about it so much that way, but like I say, Acts is for me, is pretty easy. That one is pretty easy to preach on. Again, you will hear this if you didn't already, but I said this is one of 3 dangerous Sundays. There are basically 3 mentions of eunuchs in the Bible. One is in Isaiah, one is in Acts, and one is in Matthew. Matthew is not read in the same year as this passage from Acts, so that's going to come up some other year. And I can't remember where the Isaiah passage comes up. So, it's hard for me to let those go, because they provide, like I say, opportunities for conversation. And this one, because it is so visual, it's a clear event rather than a teaching. It lends itself to story. So then, this is what it ends up with. Start, reason is lesson from Acts, and they come to the conversation. Slide. That's how I know how to change these things. So that's what the final version looks like. Okay.
And you never read the parenthetical.
Slides.
Some.
That's what's in red. Yeah. I don't say, hold up the dissertation. No. And then, computers are great, because then all I do is I go in and do the find and replace. And I go in and have a look for bracket, slide, close bracket, replace with space, and they all go away, and then you have the version that's sitting out there on the, after I print it.
Out of curiosity, how long do you think would you typically spend on a sermon from beginning to end?
Okay, I've thought about that, and does that count? I'm no longer walking my daughter's dog. you know, and so there's rumination time. You know, whether you're walking the dog or you're driving to the grocery store, there's rumination time. Literal sitting at the desk, going through all of the note taking is probably 8 hours. And then it happens that I have to write the text and edit the text and then find the visuals. So that adds probably 3 or 4 hours. And then the last thing that I'll say, and should have last slide, maybe we just have a conversation, is that at 5 o'clock on Sunday morning, I'm doing the final edits. 5 o'clock on Sunday morning, I'm doing the final edits. Usually textual, sometimes I'll think, I can put a slide here, and I'll go and find another slide. So for me, it's a week-long process. I think it is for most people. I try to not have to do too much on a day off, but it depends on whether or not the miracle occurred. And as I was poking around, when I found that slide out, and then a miracle occurred, many of us have probably seen that before. I automatically just associated that with Gary Larson, because it just seemed like such a great Gary Larson sort of kind of, you know, it wasn't. It's not by Gary Larson, and I can't remember, some guy named Garris, I think. But I did find this from Gary Larson. And that tells the truth. And that tells the truth. So I would say, Jim, to answer your question, probably the whole thing is at least 12, 15 hours. Especially the videos.
Do you find it easier to do at home where you don't get interrupted versus trying to do it here at the office?
I rarely do it here at the office anymore. Often what happens these days is I do it basically right after breakfast and I work for an hour and a half. Because it's so quiet, nothing's happening in the house. And part of the reason that I do it, I start so early rather than, you know, I have colleagues and I've been there, so I'm not being critical. You know, say, well, it's Friday and I have to write a sermon. I just can't do that because it's got to sort of sit in the back and work on itself and all of those kinds of things. So that's how I write a sermon. And again, that is developed over the course of many, many years. Reading another book and saying, oh, I could incorporate that. Some of the questions that I've asked our context, your audience, those questions really only arose maybe 2 or 3 years ago. I wasn't asking those questions of myself a long time before that. So it's an ongoing process. And of course, after having done this for so long, and Sandy can speak to this too, after, you know, some of this stuff you don't have to, it's there. You know, you're not looking something up or something like that. That becomes easier as time goes on. The story, you know, what stories come up? You're not researching stories from your past. They're in your past. Oh, this one will work here. Like one of the stories that I used this morning did. So this one will work here, will illustrate. And so can you dip into the well of storage, your own treasure chest, pull out what will help explain things. You know, or, you know, Nadine working at St. Clair's or something like that, there's this immediate sort of reality that is always in front of her in terms of her diaconal work that she would or could bring to her preaching, right? Similarly, you know, if I'm working with a couple who's getting married or something like that, and one's Jewish and one's Buddhist, that done with Buddhist, the old plan's done. You know, what comes out of those that then becomes part of, you know, so it's how do you dip into your own treasure chest. So, questions, more questions, comments? Sandy, you have anything you want to
I want to make sure that people ask you before I say anything.
Do you save all those notes or not? Or does it just come to the text and you just save the text?
Okay, good question. Here's my folder for Easter 5B, year B. So it's got all of the notes, and I do them over again, because I'm gonna see things differently 3 years later than I did the first time around. So yeah, I save all the notes. And I have gone back and looked at some old ones. to see, you know, what was I worried about? You know, and there have been times, you know, down at the bottom it says, Good Shepherd, flood in the basement. You know, that's a reality for this congregation, it needs to be addressed. Is it gonna fit into the sermon? I don't know, but it's one of the things that's a reality for the congregation.
You say that would,
Broncos win championship, that's what they're gonna fix.
you say the flood for one that we're talking about Noah or something, is that?
I could, but it would only make sense if we were if we were reading about Noah and the flood was a current reality. It wouldn't work if I said, oh, you remember that flood we had 2 years ago?
Yeah,
That makes
I gave you a hard time initially because our previous record, you know, printed it out so we could have a copy. Honestly, part of the reason I like a copy is I take communion to people and then I can kick the sermons.
No, and I will tell you, here's Easter 5. Here's the sermon that I preached May of 2003 at St. Paul's Episcopal Church in Oakland. Handwritten, number 2 Ticonderoga pencil. And in the old days, and because I got stung, and I think any preacher's probably been here, I just decided I was gonna change things. I remember 2 particular events. One was flying home from a trip. We were living in Charlotte, and I was flying home and getting ready to land in Charlotte. Saturday night, preaching the next morning, having the sermon ready. And we're circling. Circling. All the weather's too bad. We can't land. That's what they're telling us from the cockpit. Finally, they give us the clear go ahead, and we're coming in, emergency vehicles everywhere, flames. Plane had crashed. Wind shear. This was a huge crash in Charlotte way back in 1995 or something like that. I had to get up in the pulpit the next morning and preach. Was I going to pull out this sermon that had nothing to do with this major air disaster that happened in their city the night before, that would have been all over their news? They would have been watching it while I was in the air above it. Episode 2, I was preaching at a church in Berkeley, also a Episcopal church, where Phil Burchard is the current rector, you know, Bible Christian Community. And had a sermon already. We got up and read that Princess Diana had just died. I could not preach the sermon that I had written. So, back in those days, I stopped writing in advance. I would do all of this heavy lifting, and I would have an outline, and I would get up at 4:30 or 5 and write one draft, so that I was never stung again because I didn't stung. And it was always I found, and maybe some of you have similar kind of professions. I find it really hard to compose on a computer because you go back, because it's so easy to edit, you go back and you erase and you do all this kind of stuff, and then I want to see how it looks until you print out the first 2 pages. You know, I just find it, that's me personally. And so I just decided I was going to handwrite everything, and they were going to get my first and last draft at the same time. So I did that for many, many years. And when I first started here, and I walked in the first Sunday morning at 7:45, Don Fisher said, "Where's a copy of the sermon?" Handwriting? Do you want a pencil? Do you want my handwritten sloppy copy? And he helped me understand, unintentionally, 2 things. One is he said, you know, some in this building, a lot of us have difficulty hearing, and if we have a text, we can get the sermon. Okay. And then the second thing I realized, and I remembered from my time at DU, is that, and I should have known this earlier, is that not everybody processes things audibly. Process things visually, they want to read them. But when I started using the slides, Mr. Whit Hill, Hi, Greg. Said, keep this on slides, it keeps our attention. And so, so we learn in different ways, and if I thought that people were gonna learn by getting up and dancing, maybe I'd invite you to do that too, but I don't think that's gonna happen anytime soon. So this is how I've changed, even in the time I've been here, about how I preach. And so, because Don said I want sermons, I said, okay, then there must be a need different than the one that I thought was out there. And so, yeah, you did give me a hard time, Jim. And, but then when you explained you wanted to take them to folks that you take communion to, that was another reason why I should have a copy, let alone for the people who have problems hearing in the congregation. So, other thoughts, questions? You're all ready to preach now, right? Sign up. We'll have several Sundays this summer. Sandy.
One of the things that struck me very early on was that the people who came to worship would hear these readings from the scripture completely out of context. Absolutely. And, having paid attention when I was doing that, where is this coming from? How do I connect with this scripture passage? And so that's what I learned over the years to try to do, was to bring people into the story. And you did that at the beginning of the sermon this morning, when you brought us into, and with the visuals, very wonderful, into the experience of Philip and the eunuch. I mean, you brought us there, and that's what I try to do to begin with. And then over I have a sermon file that I go back to, because there are times where bingo, boy, there was something that happened, a miracle happened, and also I've been like you early on, particularly, is being in a lot of different places, and so I just do bullet points on my notes, and I have where it was and what church it was. Usually, if it was a real miracle, I can sort of reframe it, even if it's been on the 6 o'clock Sunday night here. And it's again, 3 years later. Some of them I go back as far as you.
Yeah. Every so often, Susan will say, you should preach that one again. She'll be reaching back 20 years, And she said, now I forget, I cannot remember when I did this. I may have done it here at one point. She said, get back into the back of the prayer book, back into the historical documents. Whenever you do that, that's really interesting, So, there are those things that tend to work. The other thing I meant to say earlier on, and this may be your experience too, is when I'm looking out at all of the people, it's not just where the current crises or joys are. It's recognizing that people come with very, very different understandings of the Bible and how do you address that. Or where the country is, or where the world is in terms of current events. And that, one of the things that showed up in that thing about what is the priest supposed to do? We're supposed to be pastoring the people. It doesn't say that we're supposed to be the prophet to the people. Now, that may be some of the things that we have to do, but I have to really balance that. I think pastors, rectors really have to balance that in ways that sometimes deacons can get away with, because their job is to interpret the church to the world and the world to the church. You've got to hear what's going on out there. Whereas it's my job to say, okay, how do we deal with what's going on out there? Make sense of this in our lives. So, and then the other thing, and I think I've said this, well, I know I've said it before, but maybe not in quite this public content, is I'll go through, and often I preach to me. I tell me what I ought to hear. You just get to listen to me talk to myself. And generally, there are enough people in the congregation that need to hear the same thing that it works. That's another part of the mirror. That's the other side of the mirror. Is that if my situation and Chip's situation are the same, what I'm struggling with, he's struggling with, and my answer seems to work for him, then that works. I don't know. It's an intriguing it's an intriguing, task to do. It's very different than giving a lecture, because there you're expounding, you know, you're passing on knowledge or something. Here, you're trying to do something different.
And I think he threw me this morning, because I was expecting you to go on the gospel. And then when you went back to Acts, I had to grab it and read it real quick. I knew the story, but, you know, so.
Yeah, well, the gospel would have worked with all the vineyard stuff. Because after so many years living in Northern California and in Oregon and in other places, I do vineyard stuff. This one seemed to generate more meaty things that I wanted to talk about. Anyway, thank you all. Thank you for coming. I had no idea. Thank you, Brett. It's almost time, for sure.
So you walk through Jason, and all the kids sat down there, they were referred from the church, he was supposed to sit down in the front. And he always started with, so,
Saturday night.
he never gave you enough of it.
Pressure.